Friends, colleagues and listeners, bit of an unusual one today. The reason I say that is because the gentleman that we're going to have a podcast with is somebody that I've been lucky enough to work with, lucky enough to see in action, and lucky enough to learn a little bit from him as well, which I don't mind admitting. Very talented man, tremendous on the stage, great speaker, great presenter, great teacher, great coach. For those of you who understand about the colloquial accents around England, some of you might need a translator to understand him, but it's worth sticking with it. And the person I'm talking about is Mr. Stuart Maddocks. So, Stuart, lovely to see you, my friend.
You too, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Been looking forward to speaking to you. So
it's great. Now, the reason I asked you, and I know it's a little bit late this evening, but I attended your session today, and we're here in Seville for the GSE conference. I thought it was absolutely superb, Stuart.
Thank you.
And the rest of the people that were there, you could see from the involvement and the participation, but I was looking around and there was a few people I was with as well. They were absolutely taken back, honestly. Now, you were also brilliant in Abu Dhabi at the IATA conference. So I think you've carved a little niche, my friend. I think you're going to be in hot demand.
Thanks very much. I mean, it's always a pleasure to speak to people directly, particularly face-to-face, and work with them and see if I can help them in some small way. So,
yeah, no, but seriously, I think you're going to be a very popular man. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with the audience a little bit of what we spoke about today. So it's all about the mind cascade thought process and should we change, the decision that people have to make when they're given the opportunity about change. So firstly, for those who don't know you, if you just give a little bit of a brief background, and then we'll jump into it.
No problem at all. Thanks, Chris. As Chris has said, I'm Stuart Maddocks. I'm one of the co-founders of the Calibrate Group. We're an organisation that helps people and organisations with competency uplift. We spend a lot of our time trying to understand what those organisations want and need from their people. We help them understand what that baseline looks like in terms of competency, and then we help with the development journey in order to make sure that those people are performing as well as they possibly can. Within the group, we also have a technology company that underpins all the work that we do so that we can do it at scale quickly and in a way that allows the organisation to have visibility of the competence across their teams.
And that's great. So a little bit of background always helps, Stuart. But today now, it was fantastic to see those guys being so impressed by what you did. So what we're looking at is we're looking at this mind cascade, thought process and also about the baseline change or zero order. So can you just give a little outline of what that means, and then hopefully I'll be able to jump in and maybe ask you a few questions and comment on what my experience was.
Yeah, of course. We were examining change management today and trying to look at it from the perspective of the teams and the employees that we deal with, particularly when we're at a more strategic level. One of the things that I shared with the group was a cascade that the behavioural psychologists have managed to articulate in a way that's easy to understand, and we can very quickly pick up on how this cascade relates to how we either accept change or don't accept change in our own lives. So it might just be worth me running the audience on the podcast through what that looks like.
Yeah, no.
So this cascade is often referred to as zero order or baseline change. And that means that in each of us as humans, we have a way that our brain programs and runs the thought process that underpins whether we should do something differently or not. It's an 8-stage process, and that process can happen very quickly if it's a simple change, or if it's a more complicated change where we have to analyze a lot more data. It can take us hours, days, or even weeks, depending on the complexity of that change. So the first step that we go through is a point at which we become aware of something, whatever that something is.
Yep.
The thing that's occupying our mind, that is playing on our mind when we're trying to get to sleep, the thing that we think about in the car as we drive to work, something usually that we're not happy with, be it from a point of view that we think it could improve, or something that we're worried about or concerned about in the future being a risk that we might need to mitigate against. So we become aware of something, that's step one. And then number two, what happens is our mind very quickly poses the question, well, if I do nothing about this, does that end up being good for me or bad for me? At that point, there's quite an interesting concept that the psychologists also point out to us, that is the predomination in many of us to have what is called a status quo bias, which means that we would much prefer to stay as we are in the main because it's easier and it's familiar, right? That status quo bias has a really strong pull, so it makes us want to remain stationary in the way that we view the world. It makes us want to continue doing what we've always done because it's familiar and comfortable.
Yep.
Even to the point where we will resist change, even though we might be in a situation that is uncomfortable for us or potentially damaging. You know, we can see that in personal lives when we remain in relationships for periods of time that are often too long when we should have got out. I mean, that's just a quite easy to point at example.
Well, just got to make sure now we don't want all our listeners thinking that's me and then going home and say, right, that's it.
No, that's true. But, you know, if we also think of relationships like being a relationship with an employer and work and the way that we feel about things, often we can remain in situations that aren't always positive or healthy for us.
Sorry, but it is funny there. When you talk to people who are going through should I, shall I, will I, won't I leave, you could see they're in turmoil. But once they've done it and they've experienced it, I would say the vast majority say, I wish I'd have done it earlier. Because what they learn takes them to another level. And it opens up more doors of opportunity. It
does, and the positives that come with accepting change and realising that something different needs to be done can often be really rewarding. There's another phenomenon called the region beta paradox that underpins that. That is actually, it's a requirement that we hit a certain threshold of almost pain or level of uncomfort before we do something. Make a change to our life, right? And if something's just kind of or acceptable, we can often stick with it for too long. So we then come back to the cascade, right? So that was only on point 2. We ask ourselves the question, is this good or bad for us if I remain the same? And then the next 2 points in that cascade are based upon what our conclusions are. So if we take the conclusion that if I remain the same, it's good for me, that has a problem organisationally for change, in that it means that anybody that thinks that change is bad and won't do them any good will now not only want to stay the same, but they'll also have an extra layer of defence. So they'll become defensive and they'll put barriers up about anybody or any external force that wants to change them. Gotcha. So that's the kind of dig in the heels in mentality that we've all experienced. And then the other option for us in terms of conclusions is, of course, that if it's bad for us that we don't change, now we're in a different mental state. We're in a mental state that says it's important that I embrace the need for change now. So what happens at that point, and this is a critical thing, particularly for leaders to think about, that if in each of us we need an energy and a power behind the change that we're going to make, it's the conclusion that things will not be as good for us or worse for us if we don't change that really matters. So once we grasp that, we then go into a creative mode, right, which is really interesting. That creative mode can happen quickly with simple problems, whereby we just give ourselves a number of options, sometimes 1, 2, or 3 options. If it's complicated and it's an organisational change that requires a lot of deep thought and analysis of data, that period of trying to understand the situation and decide on what the options are can take us a number of weeks, right? We've all sat in senior leadership positions and really, got together with our key people, sat in a room, talk things through almost in the ivory tower, right? We're trying to strategize out what we might do and coming up with creative options. When it's complicated, it therefore takes us a long time to understand what those options are. But when we're on our own in zero order or baseline change, we can then very quickly start to go into analysis phase. So we have our options laid out in front of us. Once we've got those options, we're able to say, well, which one's the best and why? And we use our own criteria when it's baseline change because it just affects us. So we might zone in on maybe option B and we will choose to do B. The cool thing about choosing to do B when it's just you is there's nobody stopping you.
Exactly.
So you get to choose B and then you get to do it, which makes sense, right, for fast decisions. And in actual fact, often these decisions can be made in split seconds, right? In an organizational context, it's really important that we understand that from the human side, that everybody needs to go through that. When we say that out loud, that makes us think of, well, what are the implications if I don't? And I'm sure we've all been on the end of poor change initiatives that haven't really taken off in the way that we want them to.
No, 100%. And we also covered, and I'm just bouncing around a little bit now, Stuart, but we also covered some of the reasons. And, you know, most of the reasons are there isn't enough clarity when the senior management actually give the, you know, the announcement or the drive or whatever. Then there isn't enough of a commitment. The commitments are not taken seriously, and they're not taken seriously because of a DNA or a culture in that organisation at the time. And they're not taken seriously because they all know that the top person isn't also taking it seriously. They're just going through the motions. Yeah. And that, I think, magnifies as it goes down to the floor level, and people know they don't really care. Yeah. And if they don't really care, why should they?
Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of paradigm, isn't it, when you're stuck in it, when you know you've got to do something that you don't necessarily 100% believe in.
Yeah.
It's not always that you don't believe in the actual quality of the innovation or the idea. Often it's because the nature of the collaboration has not been deep or strong enough.
Yep.
So in actual fact, you end up being on the end of change, you know, and many of us have felt that. And that lack of control around what I'm going to do in my job now creates barriers itself. So I think if we take the learning, and we talked about this in the session, right? We take the learning from understanding what the cascade is and how that works in somebody's mind. We almost need to shine a light back onto the individual and let them answer the questions that we've had in hindsight, the luxury of going through and answering for ourselves. So I think it's often the difference between saying we're going to collaborate and actually properly going and collaborating.
100%. I mean, even here at this conference, every conference, you know, you hear we need to collaborate more. We need to collaborate with this. We need to collaborate with that. And it's a lot of it's eyewash.
Yeah.
You know, if people really want to do it, then they should do it, and they need to get out and do something quickly. Which brings me to another question now, which is when people are putting together their change team, they tend to be mirrors of who they think are going to be, yes, we can do that, positive, blah, blah. But in realistic terms, you need a cross-section of people, just like any team. Yeah. But probably the most influential are, like what I said to you today, like, you know, the best sheriff is an ex-outlaw. And if people can see somebody who was really negative or, you know, talk out, if they can see them and they come across as convinced that it makes sense, a lot of people will follow that person because they think, well, my God, it must be good if that person's changed. So it's also a balancing game, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think when you want to kind of launch an idea or go live with something that you think is going to work, particularly when you're higher up in the hierarchy in the organization, you have that decision-making power. It's all too attractive sometimes to want to just use people that will back the idea. And I think there has to be an element of that in any kind of change team. I think it's important because that cascade of the cultural belief that this will work is important. Yeah. But like you say, the people that, you know, detract from that idea or are negative about it, you know, they're a representative of a lot of other people's views about it, particularly in large organizations. But the interesting part about them is they're willing to speak up, right? So they're not,
that's the thing.
They're courageous.
Yeah.
They're willing to say what they think, and we should listen to that voice because that is representative of often large pockets of individuals that feel the same, but don't necessarily have the courage, ability or voice to speak up and articulate that to senior management and leadership.
And it's a crazy thing, isn't it? When you look at somebody, and today, you know, presentations this morning or this afternoon, you know, one particular person said, oh, you know, excuse me, I'm very nervous. I'm not an Olympic, you know, speaker or whatever. Yeah. But my goodness me, they did a good job. Yeah. So when somebody starts to do something and they experience it, it gets better and they get stronger. But equally, those negative influences, once they speak up and they see that there's no challenge or there's no comeback or there's no anything, they then get more confident and then they start to shout from the tops of the hills. So if you can get that person who's got that ability to be open, get them on your side, it can really, really swing it.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, it just takes me back to speaking in Athens at the back end of last year on the ACHL conference. Yep. One of the things I was talking about was the real requirement for cognitive diversity. And by that, I mean different ways of thinking, right? So not, you know, typical diversity in terms of sex or race or age. You know, and here that the real point that you're looking for in senior leadership teams is to get other points of view to make your decision making more robust. So what it does is it forces you at a senior level to understand what rationale you need to explain in order to answer the fundamental question that most employees have, which is why, right? It's kind of a childlike question, but we take it through our lives. If we can satisfy people's question to why, often they can see the logic.
Yeah.
If we can take it back to the cascade that we talked about in terms of zero order or baseline change, if we can not only satisfy their need to understand why, but help them come on the journey to know why and want to do something differently and involve them in the creative side of what options might we have.
100%.
And that's powerful, right? That's really powerful. That's when you start to get momentum. The issue with it and the blockage, and I work with a lot of senior people. I do a lot of kind of one-on-one work as well with senior people. Often the barrier to taking that truly collaborative approach is time. I don't have enough time.
Yep.
I need to get this launched, or I need to get this done, or there's some shareholder pressure, or there's pressures from internal or external stakeholders or strategic partners, and we need to go live by October the 6th or whatever it might be. I think the challenge for senior leaders is to say, well, what if we put that back? What if we took time to truly canvass opinion? Took time to listen to the spectrum of response around this issue or opportunity. And how can we involve our people more and genuinely push through with a proper collaborative communication plan, which is easily said from here. I'm sat behind a mic, right? I get that the senior people out there are saying that's all very well and good, and theoretically, yes. But I would say, well, what's your alternative? Your alternative is that you push forward anyway, and you will never understand, because life is not a science experiment, how much more of an impact you may have had if you'd have canvassed more people.
I think I 100% agree. And I think, sometimes, even as a tactical tool, as part of the strategy, if a leader, a senior manager, realises that it's not getting to the point where they wanted it, don't be led by the dashboard, the data-driven, we've got to show the results somewhere, it's got to come up in some way. To actually sit down and say, do you know something, guys? I think if we spent a little bit more time, and I can now schedule a couple of days, I want to do this as well to support you, and get involved a little bit more from the top with the management team on the ground, everybody else takes a lot more notice of that, and I think it's a well worth delay. I wouldn't even say it's a delay, it's just a reschedule, a logical, common sense reschedule.
Absolutely, and I think it there's a few ancillary benefits to that. I think in a lot of the international conferences that I've attended and spoken at, retention's a real issue. At the moment, we all know that, right? Retention is very much linked to purpose. A lot of the people who are experienced in the industry joined because they were passionate about it and have kept that passion. To reignite or ignite passion in some of the people that are coming into the industry, we need to give them purpose and we need to involve them. And the more we involve them, the better results we'll get from them, because a lot of their ideas will start to come through. I think we've got to put a caveat in there, which is, we're not talking about every change here. We're not saying that you need to go out and truly collaborate and everything. Sometimes it's a directive. Sometimes it's got to be more about, we know more because of the data we've got and we're going to do this and I need you to understand why. And that's fine, right?
As long as you can validate and verify the impact and the benefit. Yeah. And I'm with you on all that. But the other thing that I think is the most important is the people, because everybody needs them, especially now at the moment with, so many people leaving, experience drifting down the river, and all these people who have got a different approach to the way they want to work, which is all great. But talking to another leadership coach, and you know him as well, Andrew Stottler. So Stotts, we were talking, and we were having a little bit of a joke that we should start a campaign and start printing baseball caps and T-shirts. Don't be a juster. Don't be a juster. And when people turn around and say that, I feel so sorry why somebody in an organisation would say, well, I'm just a baggage handler, I'm just a loader driver, or I'm just this, I'm just that. They're not. They're working in a specialist field with pieces of equipment worth millions, safety issues that impact on so many people. Yeah. Nobody in aviation should ever feel, I'm a juster.
Absolutely. And the more that we can get the people's opinion on the ground, the more detail that they understand about the implications of the strategic decisions that we make. It's blending the strategic with the tactical, right? And people on the ground know the tactical inside out. Sometimes in careers as you progress and you get more senior, you get disconnected. Right?
Yeah, 100%.
Unless you're walking the floor a lot, you get disconnected.
100%.
So being able to take on board and take egos and, being attached to ideas too deeply out of the equation and start to be more objective, which is part of what senior people get paid to do, is, become more objective, really, get more input. You talked about what happens when people's changes aren't being as effective as they want. Well, the brave, courageous, yet vulnerable leaders that are out there are willing to change the change.
Yeah.
They'll take on board, they'll evolve, they'll iterate.
That's it.
And they'll accept that it's not working maybe as well as they wanted. And, we won't try and manipulate the data to tell us that we did a good job.
Exactly. Don't be dashboard driven. Be realistically, respectful of what's going on down on the bottom. And you mentioned about ego. I've got a nice acronym for everyone gets old.
True.
Everyone gets old. So let that ego go as soon as possible, because you're not going to need it later on.
Absolutely. You talk about the care element as well, Chris, about making sure that we respect employees regardless of level. But I think what's really important too is to remember when I was articulating the change cascade, the zero order or baseline change when we were in the session, and what I've just tried to do today, speaking to you, is that this is something that's human. It's common amongst us, right? It's got nothing to do with your title or your level or your hierarchy or your experience. It's just how we think. It's the programs that we run. We have 3 sets of programs that I explained that we run kind of sometimes in parallel, but genuinely and in sequence. And we start off with the cognitive program that helps us understand our situation. Yep. So we should ideally spend quite a lot of time understanding it. Yep. We then run our divergent thinking program, which is where we solutionize and we ideate and we create and we give ourselves options. And the final one, which should ideally be relatively quick if we've done the other 2 programs right, is where we do convergent thinking, where we choose, right? So we analyze and we choose. You'll remember in your life, like I do, times when I agonized over decisions and couldn't decide on this or that. It's often because I didn't really truly understand the implications of those options. If I understand the implications and I've thought it through and I understand my situation, I'll often be much quicker at making the final decision. Yeah. It won't take me.
But you also like people to make changes, don't you? And relish them. Yeah. And I'd like to leave it now with something that would put everything in perspective. I mentioned that you came from a certain part of the world and you're lovingly known as a Scouser. Great characters. So for you to change to be an Everton supporter instead of Liverpool, you would relish the opportunity to give that a go, wouldn't you?
I think it would be difficult to raise the value above the cost for me to do that, but I'd be open to see how you might do it, Chris.
Yeah, you'd be open. Right. Stuart, lovely, always. And look forward to some more, and also with your co-founder, Andy. So I think we'll have a few more sessions in the future, but well done for what you've done. Honestly, it was so impressive. And there was a couple of lads sitting next to me, and they just said, wow, that man knows how to put a point across.
Thanks, Chris.
Fair play to you.
I appreciate it, and I've enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed.